Why Race Matters, Chapter 1, Part 2, picking up where we left off regarding capital punishment, discrepancies, or disproportionality. Blacks are more often executed because they more often do things that deserve execution, not racism. So, rejecting the biosocial explanation out of hand and demanding the end of capital punishment until its application is proportionate commits one to urging the suspension of all punishment, since blacks are convicted of all FBI-indexed crimes far more frequently than whites. Should a higher black crime rate be admitted but ascribed to racism, the logic of compensation used to justify racial preference to combat racism entitles blacks to reduced sentences. In fact, this seeming reductio ad absurdum comes ever closer to being proposed. Bell suggests imprisonment quotas. So I don't know if he means there's a limit to how many blacks can be imprisoned, or a certain amount of whites have to be imprisoned even if they haven't committed enough crimes. Probably the first one. One federal court overturned an anti-crack law on the grounds that crack is used disproportionately by blacks. Another has given black defendants lighter sentences than mandated by sentencing guidelines because of institutional racism within the criminal justice system. The American Civil Liberties Union opposes a crackdown on public urination as unfair to poor minorities. I wonder if they would have a problem with making public defecation illegal if there were more Indian people in America. Let's see here. And they urge legislative and racial ethnic impact statements to determine whether criminalizing an act would affect minorities disproportionately. Let's not ask if they're committing offenses disproportionately, or for what reason. Fear of disparate impact inhibits seemingly sensible educational measures, such as strengthening academic standards, grouping children by ability, and asking that college athletes pass their courses. God forbid. Congress declined to withhold loans to students at colleges with high default rates when it was noticed that this rule, quote, would have hurt inner-city students. Inner-city, another euphemism for you-know-what. The Cincinnati school system counsels teachers who discipline black students in disproportionate numbers. Wow. A decision by Mississippi to raise admission standards for state universities up to white levels has been challenged as, quote, a new strategy for locking blacks out of higher education. Preemptive abandonment of standards requires practice in doublethink. Probably many educators expect blacks to fare poorly under any objective screening procedure, yet they can neither admit to suspecting a black intellectual deficit nor declare with any plausibility that, after decades of efforts at fairness, standards remain biased. With no coherent position left, discourse relapses into formulas about a tradition of black students being served poorly by education. So basically, there's a conspiracy by all schools everywhere to keep black students down. Who's the conspiracy theorist? Finally, although this would be difficult to document, whites appear increasingly averse to norms intended to apply to society as a whole, or just to themselves, lest they be racist by implication. Whites, when interviewed, will refuse to condemn black youths who won't take low-paying, dead-end jobs, a hitherto unacceptable reason for idleness. There is a tendency in discussions of acquired immunodeficiency syndrome and illegitimacy to insist that teenage girls are going to have sex, and that talk of abstinence is foolish, intolerant, and repressive, a puzzling tendency given that no previous Caucasoid society accorded teenage girls sexual liberty or failed to condemn illegitimacy. I suspect that a major contributor to this sea change has been fear of offending blacks, whose behavior often violates white sexual norms. And as Carl Jung pointed out, very racistly, he referred to it, I believe, as going black and like an infection, kind of. Basically, it's a bad influence. A lot of times whites will lower their own standards for themselves to the lowest common denominator. And if that's only a bunch of other white people, that's not a big problem. But if the lowest common denominator is black, then that can lead to some problems. So I'm not saying white promiscuity is black people's fault entirely, but partly. But really, it's actually not their fault, because who brought them to America in the first place? Maybe we should do some investigation into who owned all these slave ships, and if they had names like Moses and Abraham and Isaac, and if these people have a history of mixing different people together to create conflict and division. Anyway, the reader who accepts genetic race differences as fact may move immediately to Chapter 6, where I begin to discuss their implications in earnest. I'm not going to do that, but I'm also probably not going to read very much from the chapters in between. I know Chapter 2, I'm not going to read anything, because it's very technical, and therefore maybe a little too boring for YouTube. Readers willing to allow that races might differ can also begin there, construing the subsequent discussion in a hypothetical spirit. They may take me as asking what follows if races differ genetically, but many readers will be disinclined to follow even that far, for conventional wisdom, I don't know if you want to call it wisdom, but conventional wisdom holds the evidence for race differences too meager to take seriously. Worrying about them is like thinking about flying saucers or creationism. Nor can mere citation of previous hereditarian work be expected to impress the dubious. I have therefore presented a self-contained statement of the empirical evidence in chapters 2 through 4, hoping to combine rigor with clarity, so that even the reader initially unfamiliar with the topic may judge the argument for himself at each step. A few stretches involve some mathematics, but summaries are always provided. More technical matters are consigned to footnotes or appendices. Although much of this material exists elsewhere in the literature, I try where possible to shed conceptual light upon it. Chapter 2 summarizes key biological and statistical concepts. Chapter 3, the evidence that whites are on average more intelligent and future-regarding than blacks. The familiar charge that standardized tests are biased is rejected in favor of a realistic view of intelligence and the intelligence quotient. A phenomenon may be considered real, I say, when it manifests itself in a variety of ways, and the multiple correlates of IQ show that it is no mere artifact or mathematical fiction. What IQ tests manifest coincides with what is ordinarily called intelligence. I was recently arguing with someone about IQ, and they were saying, oh, IQ tests are made by the white man for the white man, and that's why the white man does so good on them. It's not a quiz about skiing and polo and Norse mythology. It measures your ability to recognize patterns. And if the white man made it for white man, then why do Asians do better on average? A mistake I constantly warn against is that of thinking individual or group differences must be genetic to be real. This is not so. A man with an IQ of 120 has more of what IQ measures than a man with an IQ of 100, whatever may have caused the difference, just as a 200-pound man is heavier than a 150-pound man, whether because of a genetically more sluggish metabolism or a fortuitous injury that keeps him from exercising. That intelligence is a phenotype, to use the language of genetics, allows the reality of race differences in this trait to be investigated apart from the question of genes. Nor does it follow, if race differences are real but wholly environmental in origin, that the crucial environmental factor is oppression. Environmental factor, in this context, usually is equated with oppression. However, because at one time blacks were mistreated, and, as noted, among environmental factors, only intentional mistreatment seems able to explain the systematic depression of black attainment. That is why pressing on to the involvement of genes is imperative. Chapter 4 presents the evidence that race differences described in Chapter 3 are significantly genetic in origin, or, again, in the language of genetics, that genotypic variance explains much of the between-race phenotypic variance. This position, not that genetic factors explain all of black-white differences, but that they explain a significant proportion, is hereditarianism. Environmentalism attributes all race differences to environmental factors. If people can acknowledge and understand that skin color is a result of different genetics, then how could you possibly deny that genes affect other things? Are you saying that's the only thing that genes affect? Because that's insane. Really, really crazy. Often, hereditarianism is rejected not on evidential but moral grounds, because it is bad or racist. That is why I take pains in Chapter 5 to explain why talk of race differences in intelligence is not racist. Racism is by definition bad. That's debatable, but continuing on. Racism is by definition bad. If there are good reasons to discuss and accept race differences, such discussions are not bad, hence not racist. I think discussing or acknowledging the differences between races is racism. I know that you can't just make up your own definitions, but maybe there should be a second definition of racism. Like, the first one is thinking that you're better than other people because of your race or something like that. That's more often what is understood by racism, but to me, it makes more sense to define it as just acknowledging racial differences exist and that it's genetic, or at least partly caused by genes. Speaking broadly, the characteristic environmentalist fallacy is to infer from the possibility that an environmental factor might cause a race difference, from the failure of hereditarians to prove their case beyond all doubt, that an environmental factor is actually involved. This reminds me of something that just happened on one of my videos. Someone commented, I said something about races being different because of genes, and they said, which gene? Which gene causes this difference? And I was like, what are you talking about? First of all, it's probably a large variation of genes working in concert, working together. It's not just one intelligence gene. But even if it was, who cares what the name of it is? What matters is the way it manifests. What matters is the result. But I can't identify the gene, so it must not exist. Okay. That's like saying, I don't know the names of everyone in India, so they don't exist. What are you talking about, dude? As if I needed more proof that I'm right. Arguing with people who think I'm wrong just makes me more and more confident in my position, because they make the stupidest arguments. They have nothing. If you disagree with me, anyone out there who for some reason is hate watching, listening and disagreeing, you have nothing. You have no ground to stand on. Races are different, and it's because of genes. End of story. End of book. Go home. Not really. There's a whole lot more to go. To be sure, there are environmental variables that, when controlled for, reduce variation between races. The IQ gap shrinks by about 25% when children's socioeconomic status is held constant. For instance, more so when education is held constant as well. Fisher et al. Present further examples. However, if status and education are themselves partly determined by genes, which they are not non-genetic factors. So it's a loop. The genes cause the socioeconomic status, and the socioeconomic status changes your genes, or doesn't change them necessarily, but allows for a phenotypic expression to emerge. I ultimately stray a bit from the path of empiricist orthodoxy. To describe how the races differ is not to pass judgment, true, but leaving it at that is disingenuous. While the traits in which the races differ do not in themselves make one race more valuable than another, they are traits that people do value, do care about. It is useless to pretend, as value-neutral social scientists sometimes try to, that intelligence means no more to anyone than blood type. Most individuals, particularly Caucasoids, judge others to a significant extent by their intelligence and self-restraint. I'd say that's just as much true of Mongoloids, aka Asians, but I think we all know amongst whom that is not true. The last half of Chapter 7 argues that, by the norms that in fact guide the judgment of the typical reader of this book about matters other than race, whites are, on average, better people than blacks. I said it. Wow. However shocking this statement may sound, I believe it is a truth that must be dealt with.